All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Jennifer Miller. I am a librarian in the Adult Services Department at the Scotch Plains Public Library. And our speakers this evening are Dr. Jessica Allen, and she is an assistant professor of biology at Eastern Washington University out in Washington State. And James Lendemer. He is an associate curator of lichenology at the New York Botanic Garden, which is a wonderful place to visit. If you've never been there, I highly recommend it. And he is also an assistant professor of biology in the Graduate Center at CUNY. So they are here to, they are also the co-authors of this wonderful book. I'm just admitting a few more people here, sorry. Right. They are the co-authors of this fantastic book, Urban Lichens, a field guide for Northeastern North America, which is the perfect introduction for learning all about lichens. And among many other fascinating things, you will learn that lichens have kind of adorable common names, many of them, such as curly biscuits. And one of my favorites is warty warts. So anyway, we're going to let the experts get started with their talk, and they will be happy to take questions at the conclusion of their presentation. All right, so we'll let them go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you for the invitation to give this talk for you all and for that really nice plug of our book. I will say that Scotch Plains is ideally situated to take advantage of the lichens that are in this book. So it was really written with, I would say New York City was at the heart of the writing of this book. So the closer you are to New York, the more you can even get out of it. So definitely we'll share a little bit more about that book at the end of the talk. So let's go ahead and get started then. And really the whole premise of this book and this talk starts from the place of discussing urbanization and urbanization on a global level, right? So the development and growth of dense urban areas has dominated shifts in human movement patterns and substantially altered landscapes on all continents over the past 2 centuries. As of 2018, 55% of the human population lived in an urban conglomerate, and those conglomerates cover about 3% of the Earth's land area. By 2030, that area is predicted to triple, with 1.5 million square kilometers projected to be converted to urban areas. Population growth in urban areas is also predicted to continue, with current projections of 60% of the human population occupying urban conglomerates by 2030, and 1 in 3 people living in cities with populations over 500,000 by that same year. Mega cities, that is cities with over 10 million inhabitants, are also projected to increase from the 33 reported in 2018 to 43 in 2030. And the rapid rise in urbanization globally leads to multiple intersectional and interdisciplinary questions on human innovation and ingenuity, disparities in resource and wealth distribution, politics, history, the arts, and biodiversity sciences. Indeed, urban systems rest at the nexus of contemporary human civilization. And urban areas are very complex landscapes. They tend to be hotter and drier than the surrounding natural areas. They tend to be made of novel materials. Most of the time, they're subjected to a much higher frequency of disturbance. And all in all, these tend to be fairly stressful places when we compare them again to those surrounding natural areas. Nonetheless, we see some pretty spectacular examples of biodiversity occupying these cities, including things like red-tailed hawks, barred owls, snowy owls, coyotes. Or if we consider plant diversity and think about New York City specifically, there are 438 spontaneously occurring vascular plant species that are in Central Park. That was a number published as of 2020, and roughly, well over 2,000 plant species throughout New York City at this point, about 70% of which are native species. Now, we study urban biodiversity to learn what non-human species use urban areas and how they may thrive in built landscapes. And in doing so, we simultaneously gain a lens on ourselves, our culture, and our day-to-day environments. Now, among all of the groups of biodiversity we might study in an urban setting, lichens have a unique story to tell, and one that provides us with important information about ourselves and our society.
So lichens are fungi, and they're fungi that enter into symbioses with algae and cyanobacteria, so photosynthesizing organisms, for the purpose of obtaining nutrition. Lichens are a unique fungal lifestyle, and the symbioses they form are both complex and beautiful, sort of like our urban landscapes. Anyone that's seen a carpet of fungal-like mycelium and a smudge of green algae on a wet tree or rock has to agree that the form of the lichen, the form that they take, is just absolutely astonishing. It's completely different from any one of its constituent members if they were to grow on their own. So if you were to cut into a lichen like this one, a sea storm lichen from the southern Appalachian Mountains, you would see layers of fungal tissue, and then you'd see layers where the fungus is intermixed with the algal partner. So lichens are fungi that are alluring and unique, but they're also incredibly important. They form intimate, dynamic communities where many distantly related species grow together in close proximity. Like, for example, this branch in an old growth forest in the Great Smoky Mountains. They employ a strategy wherein the species rely on each other for their collective survival. They share members of their microbial communities, and they bolster each other, creating moist habitats that foster the growth of even more lichens. We like to say lichens beget more lichens. But lichens aren't just important to each other, they also play key roles in the lives of many plants and animals. So for instance, this lacewing larva, photographed by Jordan Hoffman on the grounds of the New York Botanical Garden, uses a cover of lichens on its back as camouflage. Lichens also perform essential ecosystem functions. So for instance, they contribute significantly to the nutrient cycling. This lichen, it fell from a tree in a forest, and it'll contribute the nitrogen that's fixed inside its body as it begins to decompose. Now, lichens are such amazing and important fungi that you would probably think they're impervious to everything. Yet the opposite is true. It's a paradox of the lichen lifestyle that such highly specialized and adapted organisms are incredibly sensitive to disturbance and to pollution. And that's why really, regardless of where you go in our local area, and even many places worldwide, lichens have declined substantially in diversity and abundance from what they would have originally been centuries ago. That's true in natural habitats on Long Island. It's true in large urban green spaces like Central Park, and it's true in heavily industrialized areas like in the Meadowlands of New Jersey.
And when we've been studying urban lichens in the past, we've really focused on the Northeast megalopolis, this area spanning from Boston to Washington, D.C. And the first person to actually coin this term of Northeast megalopolis was Gene Gottman in 1957. Of course, you all are situated right close to the heart of this region. Over 50 million people live here. That's about 17% of the US population. And it covers about 2% of our nation's land area. Now, given the degree of urbanization in this region, it's really a perfect living laboratory to study urban biodiversity. And again, not only because of that degree of urbanization, but also because there's a really strong multi-century baseline of biodiversity data, both from scientific publications and from natural history collections that are usually held in museums or at universities. Now, we really do focus again on the heart of this region, New York City.
Now, New York City is a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's indisputably an amazing and dynamic place. It has a tremendous diversity of people, of cultures, and experiences. The landscape itself is diverse. It's a network of green spaces and areas developed for a huge variety of human uses. And the long history of dynamic and diverse human occupation of the city really coincides with a remarkable degree, like Jesse said, of documentation of the natural world. So We know that New York City was once home to lichen communities that were as dynamic and diverse as its present day inhabitants. Those communities included species like those pictured here. We know that this was the case because the lichens of New York City have been documented by naturalists for hundreds of years. Through their writings and specimens preserved in natural history collections, we can understand how things have changed. Take, for instance, the lungwort lichen, Lobelia pulmonaria. This is a disturbance-sensitive and pollution-intolerant species. It's a lichen that was reported from New York City in the early 1800s. These specimens shown here document that it grew in Southampton on Long Island in 1898, and even in the Palisades of New Jersey across the Hudson River from New York City in the 1860s. This species appears to have disappeared from the region by 1914, and it hasn't been relocated today.
Now, the first attempt at documenting a list of lichens for New York City was published by John Torrey, one of the most notable botanists of Northeastern North America. His catalog of plants growing spontaneously within 30 miles of New York City does include some lichens. They are at the very end of the document, and he has a short list. The list is incomplete, and he even mentions in the text of the document that he only included species that were satisfactorily ascertained. So in this document, he published 61 lichen species. Now, the natural history collections underlying Torrey's work, unfortunately, are still missing. They maybe were lost in the many moves of the Lyceum or when the building caught fire in 1866. So we can't go back and look at those exact specimens that Torrey looked at, but we can still learn a lot by reading the publication and reading the species lists included there. Now, shortly thereafter, Halsey, who was a banker in Manhattan, published a second list. And Halsey was a colleague of Torrey, and they did correspond quite a bit. Now, he published a much more complete list. He included 191 species at the time, though this likely wasn't the full number of species present in the city. It's certainly much closer to a complete documentation. Halsey also included a comment in his report that I think still rings true today. Notwithstanding the great progress which the science of botany has made in this country, the cryptogamic branch of it still suffers under the most unmerited neglect. And when we say cryptogamic branch of botany, we're really referring to fungi and algae and basically any sort of plant or fungal form that doesn't make a flower. That's super obvious. Now, for a long time, we thought Halsey's collections were also lost, so we weren't able to actually go back and look at those exact specimens. However, just a couple months ago, James discovered them tucked away in the back corner of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden herbarium. Now, this is really exciting discovery because it will allow us to properly update the identification and the taxonomy of specimens reported in Halsey's publication, and essentially give us a much more accurate baseline of what exact lichens were growing in the city 200 years ago. Okay, next we have a very long gap, about 100 years later. Charles Wood, a graduate student at the New York Botanical Garden at that time, he published a list. Now, he ended up expanding the radius of his study. So he was actually looking at an area that included 100 miles around City Hall. So much broader area than Halsey or Torrey were looking at. And he ended up documenting 51 species at the time. And I sort of suspect he may have had to expand that radius in order to capture enough diversity in his study area to get a notable quantity of species. He also made some notes about the meager and scattered data concerning lichens in the region and made it a bid for the need for continued lichen biodiversity documentation efforts, one that surely still continues today. Okay, again, we have a fairly long gap in our timeline, and our next notable lichenologist of the region was Irwin Brodo. Now, Ernie worked on his undergraduate degree at City College. He earned his master's degree from Cornell. And he's the author of Lichens of North America. If you've ever seen that enormous book about lichens with full of beautiful photography, he's the lead author on that. Now, he conducted his dissertation research on Long Island, and he very kindly provided us with a few photographs from his fieldwork at the time. And you can see him here singing some folk songs at Stony Brook National Lab and sailing across the Sound. It seems like very delightful field work to me. And he focused on documenting the lichen diversity and abundance across the entirety of Long Island. And in that map there, you see every single site that he visited. So he did a very thorough job. And 3 of his sites fell within King and Queens counties. So we do have a little bit of a picture of the urban diversity at that time as well. And he only found a few species in the city proper, and exactly 8 at that time. So we've seen a really precipitous drop in the lichen diversity. Okay, so what is going on now, right? So where are we at this point in time? So when I was a graduate student at the New York Botanical Garden, the City University of New York, it was certainly time for our centennial update to the New York City Lichen List. So I undertook field studies throughout the city and worked a lot with the Macaulay Honors College, especially with their annual fall bio blitzes, which are organized by Kelly O'Donnell and Lisa Brundage. I revisited and surveyed many sites throughout the city, including resurveying sites that Irwin Brodo visited during his dissertation research. And then I also looked at herbarium specimens and some recently published literature. So taking all of that information together, I ended up documenting 106 species present throughout the city that had been reported after Irwin Brodo's research in the 1960s. And if you want to take a closer look at that, you're welcome to give me an email, send me an email, and I can send you the text of that document later. But it was published in the Memoirs of the Torrey Botanical Society Sesquicentennial Celebration issue. Okay, so let's take a look at that timeline overall, right? So in general, what we're seeing, right, is this precipitous decline, right, as each century goes on, and some recovery. Now, that loss throughout the 20th century was likely due to air quality, that the initial loss in the 1800s was really likely due to the building of New York City, the transition of this land from a natural area to that built environment. And then when we see that additional decline in the 20th century, that was largely likely due to air quality issues, right? And so air quality monitoring first began in New York City in the 1920s. At that time, they found that up to 50% of the sunlight was occluded at ground level by particulate matter. And then in the 1950s and 60s, there were multiple smog events that were fatal to dozens of New Yorkers. And really the passing of the Clean Air Act and further regulations at the state and city level to improve air quality have likely been instrumental in the return of lichens to the city. And we're now seeing the fruition of that. Now, when we look at these trends, if we're being very scientific about it, it's a bit hard to compare these exact numbers just because the size of the study area was different for all of these. The lichen taxonomy of lichens has changed a lot. So the methods have changed, the lichen species names have changed. I think this trend is likely real, but if we want to be more scientific about it, we can gain some much stronger evidence for the return of lichens to New York City by resurveying the same sites over time at different time points. So while assembling my checklist for New York City, I revisited sites that Irwin Brodo had visited in the 1960s, both at Alley Pond Park and at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And in both of those cases, I found a very clear increase in diversity over the past few decades. More recently, James and some of his colleagues resurveyed a portion of the Highline Park, and they found the same trend over a smaller time span. Now, while we clearly see that lichen diversity is returning to New York, there's a little bit more to unpack in this story.
So with over 100 species living in New York City now, we see these really beautiful multi-species lichen communities almost everywhere we look. So on rocks in Central Park, on dunes in Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, and even on the revegetated landfill at Fresh Kills on Staten Island. It's pretty surprising. But what's important to remember, though, is that these communities have really arisen through pretty diverse processes. And so two individuals growing side by side might have gotten there in completely different ways, and different species have really different stories. But if you look at the overall picture of the 100 plus lichens that are now growing in that have grown in New York City over time, over the centuries, it's really possible to see that they fall into one of three main categories, or they sort of their history follows one of three main themes. The first is that there are the ones that we've lost. So presumably due to habitat change and air pollution, there's species that appear to have survived through the darkest days of air pollution into present day. And then there are the ones that were pushed out of the city, but have somehow managed to return as conditions improved. And so we're going to take a few minutes and tell you some of the stories of these individual species. So the species that have been lost from New York City mainly fall into one of several groups. The first of these are large three-dimensional fruiticos lichens that are highly sensitive to disturbance and air pollution. Usnea strigosa is one such species that once occurred commonly throughout much of temperate eastern North America. You can still find it in the pine barrens of New Jersey and on Long Island. It's photographed here in all its glory on the Delmarva Peninsula of Maryland. This species presumably once grew abundantly in New York City. It was reported by both Torrey and Halsey, and although we can't know the precise locations of their collections, we know that it was still living in the city and, judging by the looks of this specimen, thriving in the 1860s. This is a specimen from Ridgewood, Queens. But after the 1860s, there are no subsequent reports. There's no subsequent specimens. The species was not found by Irwin Brodo. It was not found by us. And so, unfortunately, it appears to be completely gone. Another group of lichens that have suffered this similar fate are those that associate with cyanobacteria. They're commonly known as the jelly lichens. The last of these species was reported by Wood in 1914, and we have not found them during our present work. The case of cyanolicans is actually really well exemplified by Collima subflacidum, which is widespread in temperate eastern North America, much like Usnea strigosa, or at least once was. Thanks to this museum specimen, we know that it was growing on Snake Hill in New Jersey in 1860. And for those of you that aren't in the know, Snake Hill is located in the Meadowlands of New Jersey, just next to the Secaucus Transit Center. And it was formerly the site of one of the largest asylums in the state of New Jersey. The rock that, it was formerly the site of this asylum, but the rock that was the reason why Snake Hill was named was quarried away, and it's now located, largely quarried away, and it's now located directly adjacent to the New Jersey Turnpike. So you can see the remnants of the hill here on the lower left corner of this map. Interestingly, there are still trees on Snake Hill, but you can see just how much the lichens have changed, and it's hard to imagine a species like this Collima being able to survive there, let alone thrive there now. Then moving on to this sort of cohort of what we like to refer to as the gritty survivors. There were only a few of them. We have Cadianus Suspecia. That's another species that's common in eastern North America, where it grows on soil and the bases of trees. It was reported by Torrey and Halsey, so we can be reasonably certain that it was present in the city really early on, even though there is only one or two specimens that likely survive today in the Halsey collections that we recently rediscovered. Wood found it in Jamaica, Queens in 1914. During the height of the air pollution, Irwin Brodo found it throughout Long Island, including at one site in Queens. So here's a map of Irwin Brodo's distribution map from his book, Lichens of Long Island. This is the distribution that he found of this species on Long Island. And you can see one of the sort of colored in dots is in Queens. So that's where he found it in the 1960s. We even found it in Central Park today. This is one of the few species that really does appear to have stuck with us the entire time. But you might notice that these two pictures look just a little bit different.
Yeah, and sometimes, so we often call this the city morph effect, where yes, these lichen individuals that are living in densely urbanized areas are under a lot of stress, like, you know, that heat effect, it's much drier, high disturbance. And so they often look very different than they do in their sort of in more natural, more pristine areas. And so one of the things that we like to point out about our book is that all of the photographs were taken in the city. And so we're really trying to illustrate that city morphology, because it can be kind of hard to take these pictures of species from, you know, out in deep into in the woods and compare them to what you're actually seeing in a built environment.
So of the lichens that we see around us now in northeastern US cities, by far the majority of them seem to have returned after having been extirpated or lost in the past, pushed out in the past due to pollution and disturbance. And a really good example of this kind of cohort of species in New York City, and indeed in many northeastern cities, is this species, Carmelia capareta, also known as common green shield. This is one of the most common species in our region. And if you're driving down a road and you spot a green lichen on a tree at 40 miles an hour, it's probably this one. You might not be able to see it when you're going on I-78, but you can definitely see it on local roads. If you slow down. So here you can see it in its full splendor from Maryland. This species was actually reported from New York by Torrey and Halsey, and we actually have specimens from 3 different locations in Queens in the 1860s. So that gives you a sense of how common this species was at that time. We have so few collections dating from that period, and yet remarkably, we have 3 separate ones from 3 separate places in Queens at that time. That's pretty spectacular. But by 1914, it appears to have been completely lost from the city, and it wasn't found there by Irwin Brodo in the 1960s. And so this is a large conspicuous species that we think pretty clearly was actually pushed out of the city by that time. Interestingly, during our own work in the city, we found that it's actually present in every borough, and it appears to be relatively common in large green spaces. So for instance, here's one of Jordan Hoffman's photos taken of this species at the New York Botanical Garden in 2019. And I think it doesn't look half bad. You know, certainly compared to the disparate morphs of Cadianus Suspecia, this one looks very similar to what it looks like growing in a natural forest in Delmarva, where it's less disturbed.
And we can again take a look at the work of Irwin Brodo for more insight into this trajectory of Carmelia capareta in the city. While he was, you know, in New York, before doing his large-scale survey of Long Island, he collected specimens of this species and another species, along with the underlying bark, from much farther out on Long Island, so outside of the city. He then brought these pieces of bark with the lichen on them back into the city proper, and this was in 1961. And within 4 months, all of the individuals were dead or dying that he'd brought back into the city. So this relatively sort of robust and common and abundant city dweller that we see today, that has really rebounded in New York, seemingly wasn't able to live there at all in the early 1960s. And I suspect if we were to redo Ernie's transplant experiment today, it would be successful. Now, when we look at a study like this, we again have another, you know, a pretty good data point for considering that most of the lichen diversity in New York City had been lost by the early 1960s, which again was just mere decades ago.
And so, not to leave you with the impression that sensitive species will never return, we should briefly mention this story of Bosnian Metabolism. So you can see this beautiful species in many areas of Eastern North America, including in New Jersey and on Long Island. It's especially common in the Pine Barrens in Southern New Jersey. But like Osmia strigosa, it was lost from New York City and it was not relocated by Jesse or myself. But a single individual was found at Woodlawn Cemetery during a Torrey Botanical Club field trip in 2018. And only 2 years later, another individual was found in Greenwood Cemetery by an enterprising urban naturalist from Brooklyn. These individuals were so tiny that they could only be identified with certainty using DNA sequencing, but it just goes to show you that there is hope if conditions continue to improve.
Now, despite species that were once in New York City recolonizing, the community that has returned likely doesn't look much like what was here initially. Based on observing communities in natural areas of the Northeast, it's very clear that the species that are most abundant in urban areas do not mirror those that we see in natural communities. So for instance, in New York, some of the most abundant species are Candelaria concolor, Officia miligraina, and Parmelia capareta. And I just want to take a minute to say that if you're interested in just learning how to identify 3 lichen species in your region, these are the 3 I would recommend. Not only are they lovely and beautiful, they're your most abundant species, and they're probably grown all over the place. Now, while these species can be found throughout the Northeast, even in natural areas, their abundance is actually usually much higher in cities. So they're not necessarily equivalently prolific everywhere. Conversely, there's species that are occasionally observed in urban areas, and that abundance doesn't really mirror what we see in surrounding natural areas like that Osmia mutabilis James was talking about.
So far we've really focused on lichens that are recolonizing the city, doing it for themselves, so to speak. But there is really a steady flow of lichens that are brought into the city by humans, either knowingly for decoration, like the luxuriant branches here that were put in a planter in front of an apartment building near Union Square in Manhattan, or unknowingly because they're attached to a substrate that's brought into a city for some other use. So for instance, these rocks were brought into Manhattan for a sculptural installation on the Hudson Piers. The rocks were covered with lichens, including this Protoparmeliopsis muralis, a species that has never been known to occur in New York City. And so I think that this sort of begs the question, or at least many people might be wondering, what exactly happens to all of these lichens that are brought into the city rather than coming back on their own? Well, the answer appears to be that the vast majority of them don't actually survive. So while air pollution and unsuitable environmental conditions may have killed Irwin Brodo's transplants, it seems like most lichens are just not well adapted to being moved into the stressful conditions of the city. And studying how lichens respond to this kind of movement is something that really anyone can do. So for instance, I noticed this ornamental maple tree that was planted in front of a newly built apartment building on 22nd Street in Manhattan. And this little ornamental maple tree had many lichens on it when it arrived in April of 2015. By the end of 2015, the lichens were looking a little ragged. This also demonstrates how much cell phone cameras have changed in the time since 2015. But you can see that by 2020, the lichens were completely gone. And all that's left are the sort of ghost shadows of where the lichens once were. But this is something that really anyone can do, is look at trees and rocks and things like that that are brought into the city for some other reason and see whether the lichens persist, which ones, and for how long. And this is something that can be done with iNaturalist or any number of other ways.
So James and I also attempted a purposeful recolonization experiment, and we used 2 fruiticose lichens, a reindeer lichen, Cladonia subtenuis, and a beard lichen, Osmia mutabilis. This was a few years ago. So we collected the lichen samples from the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, where populations look very much like this field of Cladonia from Liberty State Park in New Jersey. So we gathered some individuals and we brought them back to the grounds of the New York Botanical Garden. And we nestled them into their new homes. Here's some pictures of that. And within 6 months, most of the Cladonia were gone. They were either disturbed, completely absent, or they were dead. And it looks like there was quite a bit of disturbance, maybe even from squirrels or birds specifically. But the pieces that were left were clearly dead. And the second species that we transplanted, we have some pictures of that too. So this is Bosnian Metabolism, that beard lichen, and we moved them at the same time, attaching them to their new substrates using silicon sealant here, which has been used successfully in lichen transplants in the past. And in this case, within 6 months, we saw some very clear necrosis of the tissue. And within 2 years, all of the individuals were dead. And we suspect here that air quality may have been the cause of the ultimate demise of these usneas. And one thing that we've really learned from these transplant experiments, both accidental and purposeful, is that we are not very good at predicting what exact factors are required for lichens to thrive in urban settings, and don't seem to be very successful at cultivating their presence in cities on purpose. So instead, we have a situation where lichens must recolonize cities on their own. There are some actions that we can take to create spaces that favor and help lichen recolonization. So in addition to continuing to work towards better air quality, we can support green spaces, and especially wilder green spaces. So spaces that aren't manicured, they don't have frequent applications of fertilizers, fungicides, all sorts of pesticides, etc. They're not visited necessarily as frequently as well, so they're not necessarily subjected to that same frequency of disturbance. Because it often comes down to the long-term stability of surfaces, both bark and rock, and that stability is really essential for giving lichens the time that they need to colonize, grow, and reproduce.
So the lichens, that lichens have to come back on their own is really well illustrated by the High Line. There were almost no lichens on the High Line when Richard Stalter studied it in 2004. But in 2019, I went back and I visited the last small area of the High Line that remained what I think we would call wild. I mean, it's hard to imagine using the word wild for an abandoned train line that stands above the streets of Manhattan. But there was this one small area that is left that has not been converted into the modernized park that many people visit today. Although there were no lichens in the extensive modernized areas of the park, so none on the benches, none on the planted trees, none on the wood, none that I found. There were only, or Jesse, sorry, that's right.
Yeah, and it's and that's the part that I surveyed and when I put together my list for New York City. But yeah, I also didn't find any in the modern part of it.
But then we went to this one small part and we found almost a dozen species that had managed to colonize that one small area that remained, presumably since 2004, when Richard Stalter had looked at the whole High Line before it was converted to the park. Now, to me, it's amazing that there are a dozen species or so growing in this one small area, but moreover, it includes these sort of more conspicuous fruiticose lichens that we tend to think of as being disturbance and pollution intolerant. So things like pixie cups or things like that. It's really quite surprising. And it's surprising that these things appear to be doing just fine, despite the fact that literally hundreds and thousands of people walk on the modern path that's just a few feet away from them. And they're resting, feet above Midtown Manhattan, essentially. I mean, it's just astonishing. And so protecting these urban green spaces and allowing to have some areas remain unchanged, I think that's really essential for lichens to survive in our cities, because the loss of the lichens that have managed to adapt to these novel environments is really tragic, because it means that we're losing the few individuals that may be have managed to adapt to these conditions and might actually be best prepared to survive into the future under the future conditions of this planet.
So if you're ready to go on your own lichen adventures, we did just want to give a quick pitch for our book here, a little bit of a peek inside. And if you choose to take a closer look at it, what you can expect to find. So the front matter goes over a lot of different topics that involve lichens. It gives quite a bit of background on the basic biology of lichens, the morphology that you need to know how in order to identify them, a little bit of a perspective on urban lichens globally, a bit of a discussion on how the lichens in New York City specifically has changed over time, along with a few other topics that are listed here. There are detailed descriptions and comments for over 60 species. So you can see here, there's a technical description, some tips on how to find it, a bit of a commentary on their abundance, and then some notes to help you really decide if you're looking at the species that you think you're looking at. And Jordan Hoffman was the photographer for our book, and he did a really nice job of taking these sort of pictures of species from far away and also close up. And whenever possible, we try to include photographs of the diagnostic features. So in this case, the main difference between these two species of lichens, both of which grow on rock, is the underside color. So we made sure to have pictures to illustrate that feature.
And then we also developed keys that were specifically aimed at not having to use, technical equipment like microscopes or chemicals to identify the lichens. So we developed a set of keys that are usable with just a hand lens and the small number of key terms that are defined in the illustrated glossary of the book. And with this key, you should be able to identify the vast majority of species, especially the more conspicuous ones that would be growing in any urban or semi-urban area of the Northeast. And I will say that I have given copies of this book to friends of mine and family that had no prior experience with lichens. And they've gone out in their local city parks and backyards in Philadelphia and New York. And I received text messages of pictures of lichens with questions about whether or not they have identified them correctly. And the answer in many cases is yes. So I take that to heart as having done a job well done. And I think this really means that we've created a resource that opens the world of lichens to people in cities where most people live these days, which is great.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Thank you again for the invitation to speak for you all. We have many people to thank here. But we also had a few pictures that were submitted to us, so we'll go ahead and move straight on to those and take a look at them. So we, and also, of course, thank you all for loving lichens enough to tune into this. So if we want to go into the pictures, I don't know if you want to chat about these, James, or if you'd like me to jump in, but
you can go ahead, sure.
Okay, so the first two pictures were of our Carmelia Capareta, our most abundant dweller of this region, and also really super conspicuous, beautiful, big species. It can kind of vary from a little bit grayer to a little bit more yellow, and often is like one of the first lichens that catches people's eyes for obvious reasons. It's a great species.
And you can see from the pictures, you could easily tell that that's what this species is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So those were great. And then the last one was a little Officia miligraina, it looked like, and our spangled rosette, one of Jennifer's favorite common names picked out from their book here. And this species usually grows on bark, but you can see it grown on all sorts of different substrates or surfaces. And that's something we see a lot in areas, especially like there's a lot of nitrogen deposition going on in urban areas. And that changing of the chemistry of things like metal or rock allow lichens that usually only grow on bark to kind of move on to other different surfaces. So that would be, we're seeing an example of that here.
And again, that's something that we took into account when we were writing this book. And it's another reason why using field guides from other regions that are sort of outside of urban areas don't work very well in urban areas. So besides the fact that the lichens actually look different because of how they're growing in the city, because of the environmental conditions there, they often are also growing on will be found on unusual substrates because of the nitrogen deposition and things like that. Cities are just special places. Did we have one more, or is that's the last one, right?
That's it. Yep. That's it.
Yeah.
So I think we're ready to take some questions.
Yeah.
Before we move on to questions, just let me thank you both so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I think we're all rooting for lichens, if that's the right term.
Yay!
It's just it's such a kind of inspiring story. And I will also reiterate that the book is just really a great introduction. It will kind of light a fire in you when when you walk around, you're just going to see the world in a different way, because you'll just start noticing things that you never noticed before that are actually all around us. And it's really fun. So I definitely encourage you either borrow our copy, or you could order it from your local independent bookseller or purchase it online. It's a really beautifully done little book. So we have had some questions in the chat. So let me.
Would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
It's up to you.
I can leave it up.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question, has the documentation of the species, presumably by morphology, for the ones whose specimens are available, been investigated by genetic, e.g. DNA profiling?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to take that, Jesse?
Either way, you can go ahead, James.
Sure. So I wouldn't say that the vast majority of the recently collected specimens from cities have been sequenced. So some have not, but many of the species that occur, or most of the species that occur in the city, have in fact had their DNA sequenced and have been the subject of recent studies that included molecular data. So when we talk about lichen species, by and large, we're talking about things that we do recognize to be species of fungi. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, another question. Does the fact that lichens are symbiotic associations of algae and fungi make them more vulnerable to environmental stresses, because both species have different environmental requirements that are harder to meet when there are two different species together? Interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is like a really good question for symbioses in general, especially what we call obligate symbioses. So symbioses where multiple partners are required for that organism to exist.
Yep.
So we can also think of organisms like coral, which are very sensitive to environmental change too. And so certainly like the ecological climatic requirements for each of the partners considered separately may be somewhat different. And so if you kind of think of it as like a Venn diagram of the two, where they overlap might be a little bit narrower. So I'd say certainly that can be one of the factors that dictates how sensitive lichens are to environmental change. Another one that I would also bring up at this point is that lichens are kind of just like hanging out there in nature all the time. They're absorbing everything from the atmosphere. They tend to be really excellent bioindicators and also accumulators of things like heavy metals. And so because they don't have things like leaves that grow annually and then they drop or anything like that, they do tend to sort of accumulate often pollutants or whatever may be falling from the sky.
Okay, another question. Are spores the method of lichens appearing in new places?
Do you want to take that one, James?
Sure. So lichens have one of the most amazing and complex reproductive biologies of things on Earth. And they have many species have adapted, or sorry, many species have evolved these really unique structures where the lichen basically breaks down itself and forms these little structures that break off. So they bud or they fragment, and they disperse all of the parts of the symbiosis. So the fungus, the alga, any bacteria that it needs, they disperse those all together as a single unit. And then those can land somewhere and they can germinate right away. And we think that, and they can form a clone that's identical to the parent. And we think that that's the main way that these things sort of are able to proliferate abundantly in the environment. So it's not really with spores, it's with these sort of clonal propagules, these little budding fragments. But that's because that has all of the parts together. So it's really easy for it to grow. It doesn't have to find a new partner. The fungus doesn't have to find a new partner. But then once that's happened, they will produce spores. And then if a spore does go out into the environment, it has to land somewhere, germinate, and it has to find its partners, which is far less likely, especially in cities where the lichens are not already abundant. So the spores are important to the story, but it seems like the vast majority of the lichens that you see are probably the result of these little clonal propagules that sort of blow in or move in somehow and establish, and then a lichen will grow from them and they'll begin to reproduce the same way asexually, but almost immediately, very quickly.
So there are some interesting like exceptions to that. So if we take like Xanthoria parietina in Europe, which is a really common species there that you see in urban areas. That one does seem to get around with its spores quite a bit, and it seems to spread over really wide distances and reproduce sexually really frequently. So I would say that all of the potentials likely exist, both that fragmentation James was talking about, and then species that are more dependent on sexual reproduction and the production of those specific fungal spores for their dispersal.
But they're the minority of the species that you see in a city as common things, I would think.
Okay, and how do lichens get their nutrition? From the air or their hosts?
Do you want to take that, Jesse?
Sure.
There's a little more. Has the DNA changed in the same species over time for those that have been studied? I guess those are actually two questions.
Yeah, so right, when we think about the kind of what I like to call the carbon economy of lichens, the sugar-based nutrition that we see in lichens, the algae or cyanobacteria that live in there are photosynthesizing and fixing carbon from the air to make sugars, which seems to be the primary source of sugars for the fungus. And that seems to be fairly clear when we have a lichen in a lichenized state. And then micronutrients, elements, things like this certainly could be coming from the air and from their environment. Is there anything you want to add to that, James?
No, I think that covers it. Yeah, the majority of what they're getting is from their algae or cyanobacteria.
Yeah, that main carbohydrate macromolecules. Okay, and then the second, has the DNA changed in the same species over time for those that have been studied? So I don't know of any studies where the exact same sampling of the same species, the genetics of the same species has been done over time. Do you know of any such studies, James?
No.
Yeah, so I mean, we can infer things with phylogenies and stuff like that, but looking at sort of evolutionary trees, but we certainly don't have any, I don't know of any experiments that have explicitly done that. So that's a really good question. Yeah.
Okay, and then the next two questions, I'm going to present them together. They're sort of related. Why do we associate lichens on a tree as a sign of a tree in poor health? And then the next question is, do they destroy trees, et cetera, when they are attached?
Can I take this?
Yes, either one of us, go for it, James.
This is one of my soapboxing passion projects. Lichens do not harm the substrates that they're growing on, at least not in any appreciable way, and certainly not on living substrates like trees. The lichens do not interact directly with the tree or any living host that they grow on like that. At least the vast majority of them do not, and certainly not the vast majority of the time. They have little organs that look like roots, but they are not roots. They are just organs that attach them to what they're growing on, so they don't slip off. And then the crusty ones, they just kind of adhere to it, but they're adhering to the outermost layers of the bark, which are essentially dead anyway. So when people often see lichens growing on trees that are sort of starting to become unhealthy or die, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is probably that the tree, the leaves are starting to go away, and you're getting more light into the branches and onto the trunk, and so the lichens will grow, and they'll grow quickly. And also, I think when people notice the tree starting to die or get sick, they also then notice the lichens that they did not previously notice on the tree. Also, a lot of times when people ask this question and I ask them to send me pictures of it, it's actually not a lichen. It's a fungus. It's like a wood rotting fungus that is, just appears abundantly on the tree because the tree is dying or dead. So the vast majority of the time, the lichens are not doing anything. They're a sign of positive air quality, if nothing else. And their growth or abundance, if there is any on the tree as it's dying or as it's getting sick, tends to be more of a sort of indication that the air quality is good enough for the lichens to colonize a substrate, more so than anything about the health of the tree. Does that answer the question adequately, Jesse, or would you add more to that? A lot of people really think this is a problem, and I have worked with the Ag Extension program on Long Island, the Ag Extension officers on Long Island, to try and really get the word out with arborists that that's not the case. Don't power wash your trees, don't bleach the lichens off your trees, don't use lichen be gone. They're fine. Jesse, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you covered it.
They're good. We love them. We love lichens.
They're good. I think that's an important takeaway from this program. Make sure everybody spread the word. Lichens are good.
And a lot of people do say, I've seen this huge explosion of lichens all of a sudden recently in my area. And I mean, to me, it's that what there is the air quality has improved and they've slowly been returning into over time. But it seems like maybe some of them have reached a critical mass to a point where they've been able to really become more abundant and more noticeable. That doesn't really have anything to do with the death of the trees or anything, but just I do hear a lot from people, there were no lichens here before, and now all of a sudden in a year, there's a lot of lichens. And I think it's really a longer process, and people just maybe are all of a sudden appreciating it for the first time when they notice it.
Okay, are there any, oh, thank you. This has been a question long awaited answer. Yeah, that is a very important question. So I am glad that came up. Are there any further questions? You can type into the chat, you can speak up.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
One question. In my registration form, I submitted 2 pictures of a lichens, which I believe to be that are orange colored, and just wonder if the 2 experts can help to identify them.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see those. Okay, well, you know what? I can maybe, I'll go back and get those and I'll
Sure.
them.
Yeah, maybe later.
Yeah.
So I also would like to recommend the 2 experts to make a trip when you have the time to visit the Brightwood Park of Westfield, New Jersey. There are, I believe, there are many species of lichens in the park, and I retired from pharmaceutical industry last year after a 36-year career. However, my college major was forestry and have always been interested in plants and trees. But I left most of the knowledge with my professor, so I like to pick them up again. So I'm glad to attend this seminar. Thank you very much for your talks.
I would also just like to make a plug for the Philadelphia Botanical Club and the Torrey Botanical Society that both, have field trips and things like that all the time. But also in New Jersey, Dennis Waters is associated with Rutgers University. He's retired from a separate job, but he's really devoted his retirement to, he's an excellent local historian of New Jersey. And he has devoted his retirement to really inventorying the lichens of central New Jersey and northern New Jersey. And he completed Mercer County. He's just completed Hunterdon County, and he's been visiting almost every park and natural area, every protected area in those counties. So he gives talks and he leads lichen walks as well. And I would really suggest getting in touch with him as well, because he's a really great resource and he's super knowledgeable and he's also super active and engaged in New Jersey. So, yes.
Thank you.
I'm happy to put you in touch if you email me.
Okay.
Great. Yeah.
And we can look at your pictures.
If I can get that information from you, and then I'll include that, some of those suggestions in a follow-up email to everybody who registered, along with a link to the recording. So yeah, that'll be great information. Thank you for those suggestions.
There's also a Master Tree Steward program in Union County. It's the only one in the state. Are you familiar with that?
Which?
The Master Tree Steward program.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's the only one in the state. And Jim Nicknatowicz runs it. He's at the Union County, I forget the name of that, Central Avenue or something like that. He's in that office. And those offices have just opened. And I happen to be part of that program. And you might be interested in finding out more about it and becoming associated with that. It's very interesting. And one of the projects that they do is we go out to the public schools or any school in the area and teach about trees and nature and things like that as well. They also do a lot of a tremendous amount of conservation in the parks and just touring and education. So it might be, if you especially have an interest in that kind of thing, it might be something you'd want to look into.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Master Tree Steward program.
That'd be great.
Yeah, there are definitely lots of opportunities for anybody who is either inclined to do more or learn more and contribute more. So that we appreciate that. Any further questions? I thought somebody had raised their hand. No. Okay. Well, I want to thank Jessica and James so much for sharing their expertise and their knowledge in this great program. Thank you. Oh, wait. You showed two photos of the same lichen that were second photo was gray and flattened that were remarkably different. How were you able to identify that the new one was the exact same species as the one from 1918? By the way, great presentation. So I think this is referring to, further back in the presentation. Yeah, the new one was the same species as the one, the sample from 1918.
Yeah, I would say, and I'll take a crack at this, and James, you're welcome.
Go for it.
Into so there's a lot that we can see from a faraway picture like this, knowing what species are present in the area and how abundant they are. And so from the realm of possibilities, even from a faraway picture, we can kind of learn a lot. But when you take a much closer look at these, there's a ton of sort of, especially if you just take a hand lens with you, it's like it's a whole different world under there. And it's very, there's a lot of complex structures that we can really very clearly see define what species are and make it really clear to us that this species is that same one that we saw, way back in history. And I think that's that when we're looking at lichens from sort of our human scale with our human eyesight, they sometimes seem to look very, or there's like a whole realm of different possibilities that sort of superficially might like look quite different initially. But when you look for those much smaller structures, you start to see that, oh, wow, okay, so these are actually the same. And there's just, you know, kind of figuring out what all of those realms of sort of far away morphology might encompass, and the variety of colors that we can see as well, because, you know, sometimes they're more yellow, sometimes they're maybe a little bit grayer. So there's some natural variation there essentially. And you kind of just get a feel for it, but oftentimes looking closer is really the key to being clear that you're seeing the same thing. James, what would you say?
And just to reiterate that what we do when we look at a specimen from 1820 or 1918, and a specimen, you know, and either something that we see outside and observe ourselves or that we collect ourselves, we're doing the same thing that, you know, botanists have been doing for hundreds of years and are doing still today. You know, you can go to a natural history collection, an herbarium, and you can look at a specimen of a plant collected 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and you can identify it using the same characters that you would use to identify that plant today. And we're doing exactly that thing. The lichens don't change and degrade over time. In fact, in many ways, the lichens, specimens of lichens are in many ways better and more stable, easier to preserve than plant specimens are. But we can look at a specimen from 100 years ago and we can say, oh, it has all the characters that you need to know that it is the same species that we would call something today. So all of that's there preserved in the natural history collections. And that's why those natural history collections are so important to really serve as a legacy, to have, you know, this sort of like the ability to go back and look at how things have changed over time.
Yeah,
I
and
hope yeah.
There's another good kind of follow-up question to that somebody asked if they look the same in winter and summer.
Oh.
And so they do. So they, you know, unlike plants where there's like specific timing to different every year when the leaves come on and the flowers, etc. With lichens, it's year-round. Lichenizing is a year-round activity. They are always there. They're always looking the same. The major differences we see is when they're dry versus when they're wet. And so, you know, lichens are, they live at equilibrium with the moisture of their environments. So if it's raining, they're going to be wet. If it's really humid, they'll be wet. If it's dry outside, then they'll be dry. And they do they look quite a bit different when they're dry and when they're wet sometimes. So sometimes if they're dry, it's fun to go take a water bottle and re-wet them yourselves and watch them like expand and absorb that water, and the color will change, and they kind of they look like they're blooming in a way, though they're not technically blooming. So yeah.
And it's, you know, it's the great thing about lichens is that you can really look at them year round, but also they're there in the time of the year that it's nicest to be wherever they're growing. So if there's a part of the year where there is no ticks or where there's less ticks, you know, or where maybe poison ivy is not leafed out, or when maybe if you like looking at flowers and there's no flowers to be seen, you can look at lichens then. So they're sort of the ideal thing because they're always there for you to appreciate, but you can also appreciate them in the times when it's sort of most enjoyable to do so.
Great. Okay. I think that's it. So, you know, besides the many comments coming in about this is a great, you know, great program. Thank you so much. So yes, thank you both. This was a really special opportunity, I think, for us. And thanks everybody for being with us. Just watch for a follow-up email from me, and see you at the next program.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Okay. Thank you.